Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner. Hey there, listeners. Did you know FNMC is hosting our new music festival October 11 through 13 in Omaha? Proposals are open through May 15th. But if you missed that date, we hope you'll still join us as we celebrate music for all instrumentations written in the past 50 years. Highlights will include the final round of our flute artist competition and world premieres of our consortium commission by Rena Esmail, as well as a special commission by Michael Janice. Visit www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com for all the details, and we'll see you in Omaha. For many years, Zara Lawler has integrated dance and theater into her performances with the innovative ensemble Tales and Scales, in collaboration with choreographer C. Neil Parsons, and in large-scale choreographies for flutes, including E Pluribus Flutum, Lawler's work for 60 dancing flutists. Lawler has given solo recitals in New York, Santa Barbara, Hong Kong, and has appeared as a soloist with the Atlanta, Utah, Indianapolis, and Oregon Symphonies and the Hong Kong Philharmonic, and in venues including the Kennedy Center, the Kravis Center, and Lincoln Center. Her activities during the pandemic have included the world premiere of Howl, a spoken word and dance piece with double take dance as part of the Higher Ground premieres in New York City, a series of farm concerts, which were performances for safe audiences of farm animals and plants, and Symmetrical Lives, an innovative music dance video of J.S. Bach's Suite in B minor, created with violinist Maha Serar and choreographer C. Neil Parsons. Zara Lawler's solo show, The Flute on Its Feet, was featured at the Orlando Fringe Festival in May 2019. Zara teaches at Manhattan School of Music Pre-College and Silver Music, and she has a blog on practice techniques at thepracticenotebook.com. And she's here with us today. Zara Lawler, thank you so much for joining us this morning. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
I've been looking forward to this.
I feel really honored.
So are we. I think I first heard of you. I mean, it took years for me to actually be in the same place and meet you. But I knew about you for years before we met from a former classmate of mine who won a spot in Tales and Scales, which feels like a very turn of the century thing. I don't know if do they even still exist?
Not that I know of. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So for the younger listeners, which is probably a lot of our listeners, can you give us kind of a Reader's Digest condensed version of Tales and Scales? It was a really unique ensemble, wasn't it?
So Tales and Scales was a national touring ensemble that was based in Indiana. And we did new music and new theater for children and family audiences. And it was a quartet: flute, percussion, clarinet, and bass trombone for most of the time, although the instrumentation changed a little bit over time. And what we did was we'd commission and create a new work every year, and a work for us was usually 35 to 50 minutes long, and it would be a story told through music. So I like to think of it as like, it was almost like opera, except instead of singing, we played instruments. And we would act out the story as well as play the music. So it was just the four of us on stage, and we were all acting and dancing while playing. So it was like, in that sense, it was like opera. It was like a Gesamtkunstwerk, but to use a fancy music word, but with a directed audience of children and families. So we worked with composers, we worked with theater directors and choreographers. And I was part of Tales and Scales from 2000 to 2008.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. I loved it so much. We traveled all over the country. We did up to 200, sometimes a little more than 200 shows a year. Wow. Some of them were in schools, school cafeterias, school auditoriums, community centers, but then also in beautiful performing arts centers. We did regularly performed with orchestras as soloists as part of their family series. So it was really, it was a great gig.
What an amazing impact it must have had while you were traveling around.
Oh yeah, it was such a neat, one of the things that was so cool about it, we often think of performing for children and families as educational. Like
Mhm.
we're trying to teach the audience about music or about the instruments, but Tales and Scales was really more like that experience that we as grown-ups have when we go to a beautiful arts event is a kind of transcendent experience of being transportive, actually maybe is better than transcendent. We get transported by the performing arts, and what we tried to create in Tales and Scales was that experience for children.
Wow.
So I mean, I'm sure it was educational. But I think the main thing was this creating this world of sound and movement and story that captivated the audience
Mm.
in a way, in that magical way.
That's cool. And then just letting them be a part of it rather than this. Yeah, I think I've played a lot of educational concerts with local orchestras, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a valiant effort, but I think they can be patronizing.
Yeah.
So this sounds like, a choice to treat children as, becoming adults and having brains in their heads instead of
Yeah,
here's
and
the food.
yeah, exactly. And I feel like it was not so much like we're developing audiences of the future, but we are performing for a target audience. Like
Yeah.
this is the audience. They already are the audience. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it was really, I mean, and it was just so freaking fun. Just creating the shows and performing in this different way. It was really impactful for me. It's probably obvious for people who are aware of my work that's interdisciplinary. This was like a big part of learning to do that and do it creatively and do it at a high level. But also just so fun. I mean, I can't get over how fun it was. And also performing from memory. We did everything from memory so that we could move and act while we played. And it was a kind of repertory company. So we would have 2 or 3 shows running in any year-long season. So they got really refined, highly tight ensemble wise, and it was very comfortable. It got very comfortable to perform that way, which I think is an experience a lot of musicians don't get to have, because we just are always learning something new, always learning something new, always playing the newest thing, doing it on minimal rehearsal. So that was also a really just powerful experience for me as an artist.
I was gonna ask because I think most of us know of you as one of the OG dancing flutists, or the OG dancing flutist. Are you the OG? Did that all
Probably
come
not,
after
but
Tails and Scales?
I had been interested in this kind of work before Tales and Scales. So my first like real job out of school, I played in the Hong Kong Philharmonic for 3 years, which was, like a regular orchestra gig. And I left it because I wanted to do more solo and chamber work, and I wanted to do stuff that did combine the arts. So for a brief time, I had a chamber group in New York where we were experimenting with ways to do that. So we had, for example, we did an arrangement of pictures at an exhibition, and we performed it in a gallery, and the horn player who played the promenades was in period costume, walking from painting to painting while she played, and that kind of thing. So we were just sort of like, felt like I was experimenting with it, and then I got the opportunity to audition for Tales and Scales. And actually, as part of the audition, they performed for me. And like, I think my jaw dropped open, and I was like, oh, this is what I've been trying to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And one of the things that was neat about Tales and Scales, one of the big things that attracted me, was that they also worked with other musicians. So we would do workshops with orchestras or in music schools, finding ways for musicians to get more comfortable moving and or acting, and just in all of those parts of performance that require more than just being skilled on your instrument. So I had sort of, it was the tip of the ice. I keep doing gestures, physical gestures for you guys to see, but you can't see them on the
Pinching
podcast.
hands. They're pinching hands.
Pinching hands. Well, it was somehow it was supposed to be like a tip of the ice. It was like just the tips, the tip of the story. And then Tales and Scales was like a much more complete, deep way of doing that work.
Wow. Yeah, and you still work with Neil, who was the trombonist at the time. He choreographs for you. Is there more to it than that? Am I oversimplifying?
So Neil Parsons was the bass trombonist in Tales and Scales when I was there, and he also is a trained dancer, and he and I have done a number of collaborations. The main one I would say is that he is the choreographer of many of my projects. But he is also sometimes a performer in the projects as a dancer. And when we've worked together, like all of us in Tales and Scales, he has many skills. So we've worked when we put together shows, we've written stuff together. We've created some music together. We did an experimental set of performances on buses at Indiana University, on campus buses. We wrote that whole thing together. So that was like, we wrote the music and made the movement and, did the whole thing together.
When was that?
So when was that?
Yeah.
2009 or 10, something like that.
Yeah, I was gone by then. Man, I would have loved that.
You can find it on YouTube. It was called Reverse Busking, because the idea was we gave free tickets to a show instead of asking people for money. And we were on a bus. But also, I actually still work with a number of the people from Tales and Scales. Parker Fadul, who is the percussionist in Lawler and Fadul, had been in Tales and Scales. I occasionally do gigs with your friend, Chris Grimes, the clarinetist from Tales and Scales. We all sort of are still
what a family that
in each other's orbits and family. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
This is a complete reversal.
Mm-hmm.
That was all lovely. Thank you for taking me down that memory road.
Yeah.
Your website is so rich and so full of content. And so I'm going to keep referencing this. You do so many things and I'm fascinated by them all. So I wanted to ask you to describe how you spent the pandemic artistically and personally, if you want, because you did some really cool looking stuff that has been curated on your website.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, I spent the first year of the pandemic being like a homeschool mom, which was certainly something I never thought I would do. My daughter was in kindergarten when the pandemic started. And, as a family, we were so lucky. My wife is a college professor and her work just went right online. Uninterrupted. And my daughter's school was amazing. They went right online. The teachers were so creative with how they use Zoom, but she was in kindergarten and she really couldn't navigate that by herself. So and I was lucky. I mean, it was a bummer for my performing schedule, but I was lucky that my teaching also continued pretty much uninterrupted. So we were okay financially. We were able to be safe physically. We actually were able to leave New York City. And for the most part, really, for that first year, I just was the homeschool mom. There were so many sucky, horrible things about the pandemic, but getting to sit with her and watch her learn and literally be in the classroom with her was a real gift for me. I will say, though, after a year, I was like, I need to play the flute. And we had another real gift. My mother-in-law spent 6 weeks with us at the beginning of 2021, and she became the homeschool parent. And it was almost like an artistic retreat for me. I just had time to practice, to take long walks, to look at nature, and to kind of get back into creativity. And it was around that time that I started working on the Bach B minor project. I had wanted to do a choreographed Bach B minor suite for a long time, and had actually planned to do it for the 2020 Flute convention, which became impossible, as we all remember. But in 2021, picked that project back up. I worked with Neil Parsons, former member of Tales and Scales and choreographer, and a wonderful violinist who lives in my neighborhood, who I met on the playground. Her daughter is a little older than my daughter, and we were chatting one day, and she was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm a flutist." And she was like, "Oh, I'm a violinist." And then she was like, well, where do you play? What kinds of stuff do you do? And I was like, well, I do a lot of wacky stuff where I dance and play at the same time. And she goes, oh, that's funny. I do a lot of wacky stuff where I dance and play at the same time.
What?
Wow.
Yeah, just on the playground, just like this is New York City. So anyway, her name is Maya Sarar, and she's a wonderful, amazing violinist and mover. So we decided we had done a play date together way before the pandemic, like way before, where we just gotten into a rehearsal studio and messed around with moving and playing at the same time. And we captured a lot of it on video. So when we started working on the Bach project, we watched those videos. We spent a lot of time just watching those videos and finding things that were interesting to be the basis of our choreography. And one of the things that's so interesting about the Bach B minor suite, we flutists think of it as a flute solo, even think of it as a flute concerto, maybe. Well, I did. Okay, maybe I shouldn't speak for all flutists, but I always thought of it that way because some of the first flute music I ever learned, I learned the dun da 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 dun dun. What's that one called? The rondo. It was in the Robert Cavalli flute book. And it was the only piece in the book that didn't have notes that were super high. So that was one of the first flute pieces I ever learned. And, so I thought of it as a flute solo, but really it's unison, flute and violin, for almost the whole time, which turned out so we were doing all this development on Zoom because I was in Massachusetts hiding from the virus. Maya was here in New York and Neil lives in Boston. And so we were always on Zoom and watching our videos and listening to the recording. And then we had a couple of rehearsals on Zoom. And it was so interesting because when you're rehearsing something that's in unison with someone, Zoom is actually not a bad way to rehearse it. One person can be muted and the other person just has to match what they are hearing. It's like a really interesting musical exercise where you just have to match what you're hearing in real time. And we would just trade back and forth. And so we started to, learn the music that way, started to get a sense of movement possibilities by watching these videos. And then, when it started to be like safe to rehearse outside, we rehearsed outside when I was back in New York. And then this beautiful thing happened when everybody was vaccinated, but nobody had any gigs yet. And we put together a string ensemble to rehearse it and record it with us. That came together really easily. We played with amazing other string players. To have that be the first music played together after the pandemic. I mean, it was actually in this room and my wife and daughter were, you can see the kitchen. Oh, you can't see this on the podcast, but right behind us, and my wife and daughter were hanging out in the kitchen just listening, and they cried.
Aww.
Just to hear such beautiful music live after such a long, and so beautifully played together. I mean, I had played with my students on Zoom. And my daughter's learning cello and we would play together, and she was 6. So it was nice, but it wasn't like a professional ensemble playing Bach. And the B minor, it's like the music is so sort of inherently sad sounding because of the B minor,
Yeah.
So it was really quite a moving experience for us all. But that became a film. So we made a film and we called it Symmetrical Lives. One of the things that was beautiful about flute and violin visually is that we are symmetrical in a way. The flute sort of sticks out to the right and the violin sticks out to the left.
Yeah.
and so that became a big theme in the choreography of it. And since we really couldn't do it yet together as a live performance, the film became a really fun playground for us. You can see that film. It is on the website. It's called Symmetrical Lives. We did premiere that film at the National Flute Association's convention that was online in 2021. And then it was actually officially, that was like a little pre-premiere, and the official premiere was part of the Metropolitan Museum's. They had a series called The Balcony Bar from Home, and it was part of that series. I mean, it was such an interesting project to work with a string player. I worked with a lot of wind players and percussionists, and I've worked by myself a lot, but to work closely with a violinist and then a string ensemble was like, it's just so beautiful. It's such a beautiful combination. And I've done a lot of new music, and new music is beautiful, but Bach, there was something so deeply satisfying. I feel hesitant to say that on a podcast called New Music Crush, but there was something just very, very deeply satisfying about that. And then we did make a live in-person version of it with the same string players who all moved while playing. That's been a really super exciting project for me and a super exciting development. This thing of working with a bigger ensemble, working with culturally familiar and meaningful music. That was like the biggest project during the pandemic time. I did a lot of concerts that were much smaller. I had a little experimental series called Farm Concerts. My sister has goats and chickens, and I did performances for both audiences. I did a performance for the goats, and then I did a performance for the chickens. I will say the goats were a way better audience. Yeah, they were super into it, but the chickens really didn't care.
I have not spent a great deal of time around goats, but it seems to me that they would have opinions.
Well, maybe they seemed interested.
Okay. Okay.
When I was playing for them, they just stood right there at the fence, just like their
Okay.
eyes open and listened. Whereas the chickens, when I played, I was actually in the chicken coop for the chickens, and they just wandered around like it was just a normal day in the chicken coop.
Rude.
I know you guys like to talk about chickens in this podcast, so I did want to make sure I mentioned that.
I like how she grouped you in on that, Nicole.
I mean, I let you take the lead because you're more the expert, Elizabeth, but I enjoy it as well.
I like that
just
we've
enjoy
got
the
goats
show.
in here now too. I'm gonna make that the
Yeah.
season 2 animal. Just you wait.
Good. More animals, please. Well, don't take it personally though, because I think chickens' brains are very, very tiny. So
It's true. I did try to choose thematic music. So for the goats, I played Danse de la Chèvre, which means dance of the goat.
Mhm.
And although I also did a Bach minuet for them. And then for the chickens, I did a movement of a Blave sonata that it's called Les Caquets, which means the chickens. It felt appropriate, but like I said, they just were just like pecking around no matter what happened. I did a very tiny concert for a flower, for an amaryllis. There is a piece called Amaryllis, and I played it for the amaryllis. And then I did a concert where I chased a bunch of ants who were like on some sort of like migration across a field, and I played the ants go marching. And as far as I know, nobody got COVID at any of those events.
So the goats, you got a reaction from the goats, but you probably didn't get much of a reaction from the ants, or if
No, the ants
then
didn't. As far as I could tell, the ants didn't even know that I was there.
Yeah, but what did it do for you, or playing for a flower? I mean, did that create a new perspective that has stuck with you at all?
That's such a great question. Playing for the flower was in order to get to the flower, I was down on one knee.
Mhm.
And it really felt like I was like honoring this flower. And especially, I think, partly because of the pandemic, this like honoring the life force that it was sustaining us all. And one of the things that really I experienced and was able to enjoy, again, I'm so grateful for not having been badly affected by the pandemic, slowing down, but just by spending so much time in nature. I think I probably took an hour-long walk virtually every day out in nature somewhere, and just appreciated the change of the seasons in a different way, started to notice things in nature that I had never really noticed, because I think just because everything kind of slowed down. And so to just sort of like spend this time kind of focusing on a flower and bringing to it my art really was actually a really moving experience. And the other thing about it that was fun for me was to really lower the stakes. I don't think goats really notice if you play a wrong note. They don't really expect you to show up in like concert clothes. I mean, I was just wearing shorts and a t-shirt. And I think that just sort of like the fun of that, and the just like, oh, it would be funny or fun. I've often, like on Zoom lessons, if I had a student playing Danse de la Chèvre, I would like take the device outside so they could like, this is a goat. look how they jump around. This is what this music is trying to capture. And then just like this thought, and like I would have my students play on Zoom, for the goats. And I was like, why am I not playing for the goats? I think just the kind of like fun, spontaneity, show up in your t-shirt and shorts and put it on the internet, kind of like the lowered stakes of it was also a really nice thing for me. I think especially, with classical training, we can all get so worked up about perfectionism and what everything is supposed to sound like, and supposed to look like, and to just be like, I'm just going to sit in this chicken coop and hope for the best.
You've described several different performing projects that are ongoing in your life. I was going to list them all as I asked you about them, but links are in the show notes to your website and to some of these specific projects. You do a lot. You also maintain a blog, the Practice Notebook. You teach, you have your own studio, as you've mentioned. You teach for Manhattan School's pre-college program. How do you do it all? And why do you do it all? Not in a negative way, but I mean, like, what drives you to do all of these things, and how on earth, how much coffee do you drink in a day?
That is a good question. I give slightly too much coffee, but a lot less than I used to. Well, the teaching, when I was in Tails and Scales, it was a totally full-time 12-month-a-year job. Yeah. So I did not teach, and we were on tour all the time. And then when I moved to New York and have been working on these independent, artsy, wacky projects that I do, I really needed something stable to add stability. So that's how I got started teaching, was honestly, I will confess, really out of necessity. Although I haven't been opposed to it. I early on got asked to teach at the Manhattan School of Music pre-college, which I actually attended as a high school student. So it feels very cool to be there as a teacher now. And I really just enjoy that one-on-one time with serious high school students. And by serious, I mean, they're serious about the flute. They're not necessarily, it's not like we never crack jokes. They're fun to teach because I'm not making a case for the flute. I'm just really there to guide them through this really important part of their development, which is so interesting. And then I got involved in Suzuki teaching. I got sort of drafted into it by a number of Suzuki teachers, Wendy Stern, Noel, Perrin Bryson, and a few others who are here in New York. I had done workshops for various of them, and they were like, you really should do some Suzuki training. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I did get into it. And I got into it partly because their students were so good, and their students were they sounded so good, and they were so open to creative ideas in the workshops I was doing, which were about movement and music. I was like, something is working really well with these teachers. And so since then, I've become a Suzuki teacher, and it's a really great way to teach. So interesting. And it makes the teaching so effective. Like I really get into it now. And what's one thing that's been really fun that I've been noticing in the last few years is the way the teaching informs my creative work. So like one of the pieces that I just completed a video of is Adolphus Hailstork's flute set, which I learned last year because one of my students was preparing it for the NFA high school competition. And I was like, wow, this piece is just so fun. And it just seems like it has so much movement possibility. So I worked with a choreographer this year here in New York, and she choreographed it, and we shot video of it this summer, and we just finished the edits like last week. So that's going to be released online. But it's been fun for me now. The teaching really used to just sort of support my creative work, and now it's like feels like it's a much more porous boundary between the two.
I'm often curious, when people have a lot of ideas and also a busy schedule, how do you decide which ideas have legs to be worth pursuing? Or if you have to like pick and choose between things that you're doing, what do you have a process, or does it happen more organically for you?
I think it does happen more organically for me now. Just to backtrack a little to answer the question a little more, when I was in Tails and Scales, which was a full-time job,
sure,
I didn't do all of those other things. I just did one thing. I would just imagine, for example, if I had a college teaching job, I might not be doing all of these things. And one
Think
of
it's
the
the
things,
time or the structure?
I think it would be both. One of the things that I'm noticing is it's been interesting sort of tracking how the Bach project came together, because at first we were really having one Zoom meeting every 3 weeks. And in between, I'd listen to the music or I'd think about it when I was out on a walk, but it wasn't like I was like working on it. In the early development stages, a big project doesn't take that much time. Then we started having more regular rehearsals. And then once we had put the ensemble together, we had to rehearse with them. And then it became kind of like this thing that we all know as musicians, where, you have your three or four rehearsals in 1 week, and then you have your show. But the run up to that was so gradual that I'm actually realizing, especially as I want to do more bigger projects, that it's maybe possible to have more than one in development at a time. I feel like that must be how an opera company does it. They don't just choose one opera and then do nothing but that opera until it's performed. So what I've been doing lately, and it is funny to think about how many of these things are sort of impacted by the pandemic. One of the other things for me about the pandemic is it was really the first time I had a predictable schedule in my adult life. I do have a half an hour to an hour and a half of creative time, whether that's practicing or doing research or listening to recordings for various projects a day, most day, 3 or 4 times a week, maybe. And I kind of, during that time, I allow myself to follow my instincts a little bit. Like, I do try and touch the flute every day. But for example, right now I have a project in development that's based on A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And so maybe one day I'll spend, a half an hour practicing the flute for whatever performance I have coming up, and then half an hour rereading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, or looking at some of the music that's in the book that I want to use in the project, or having a conversation with an artist who might be part of the project. Just at the very beginning stages of I'm interested in developing a project based on Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. So, I listen to the Fourth Symphony, or I actually have the flute part. I get out the flute part and play it, or I read my biography of Tchaikovsky. And that's kind of enough now. But like I allow myself to be like, what seems super interesting to me today? Is it Tchaikovsky or A Tree Grows in Brooklyn? Or do I really need to practice for this thing that I have next week? Then they get to have legs when I pitch the idea to someone and they're like, yeah, we'd love to have that performance. So for example, the Bach B minor project, we didn't really start working on it until the NFA was like, yeah, we would love to have that as a gala performance at a convention. And then I was like, okay, I shall, now I have a deadline. So that helps too at some point, to get it out of just my head and into the books, as it were.
Can I back up and ask about a specific project that's several years old now, but I think I'm a little bit obsessed with it. Can you please talk about the Barrio Sequenza? And for listeners who aren't familiar, I will link a video in the show notes, but describe it. How did you come up with it? What were you trying to achieve with your unique performance of this?
Barrio Sequenza is a piece of music I have been interested in since my first year in college. I was at Oberlin College. I was not in the conservatory, and I was studying with a student who was in the conservatory. Her name was Esther Landau. She was a senior the year I was a freshman, and she was super into that piece. And she performed it on her recital, and Barrio came to Oberlin that year, and she performed it for him in a master class, which we all just lost our minds at how amazing it was. And so ever since then, I've thought, one day I'm going to play this piece. And it's a piece that has, there's sort of a piece of controversy in the flute world, in that it was written first with this kind of spatial notation where the rhythm is notated just by how far or close the notes are to each other. And then several years later, Barrio rewrote it with traditional notation, and people have all sorts of feelings about which version you should play and how strict you should be. And there's a lot of shoulds in it. So when I was talking with Neil, who's the choreographer for that project, I was like, I really want to do something with the barrio, and I really want to reframe it somehow so that it's not just a like, how should I perform this, but what or how are we going to perform it, to take the shoulds out of it. And so we just started like riffing on the idea of frames and decided to have kind of a play date. Many of these choreographic projects, early on in the process, there'll be some sort of play date where we just go into a studio and mess around. And we went into the studio. We tried to find different sized frames. So we had like a little frame from IKEA that was like about the size of a phone. And we had like something that was more the size of a music stand, kind of like the idea of having a, framing the music somehow. And then we had this coat rack from IKEA, this $6 coat rack from IKEA, as a like big frame, almost like a door frame. And we set that up in the studio and immediately got so fascinated with this coat rack and how cool it looked to be playing the flute in it and next to it, and sort of to be inside it in a frame, that we never even tried anything with the other frames. It just immediately became this frame piece. And it also became clear that this $6 IKEA coat rack was not going to cut it as an actual prop piece. And so we had a frame made, and it is almost the same proportions as this IKEA coat rack, although we asked for certain specifications, including that it would be strong enough that I could stand on it, that it would have wheels that lock and unlock, that could go 360 around. That was the basic idea, is that it would be reframing the barrio. And as we were working with it, we realized that one of the things that's so interesting about spatial notation is it's this idea that you can see time. That when you look at the score, you can see how time should pass. And I think we also originally had this idea, or early on had this idea, that somehow we could show that with the frame, like that there would be some measured way that I would work with the frame. And that ended up not really being physically possible or visually convincing. But in the meantime, we had so much, the frame just made so many possibilities for me as a solo person on stage. Again, to be within it, to poke out from it, because it was on wheels, it can move. I could move in ways that I could never move just by myself. It was just a really fun, to use your word, organic process in the end, of just exploring all the things that could be done with the frame, and then finding a narrative order in which to do them, and then finding in the music where that order, where specific events should or could happen. Funny that you should mention it. I am, bringing it back now. So we created that piece 10 years ago.
Been that long? Wow.
Yeah. I was 10 years younger when we created that piece.
I see where you might be going with this.
Yeah. So it's been interesting. And I didn't touch that at all. I haven't touched it really probably since a little bit before the pandemic, since 2019, I think. I did quite a lot of performances of it in 2019. And so bringing it back is an interesting process, relearning the music, relearning the movement, to be determined how that all feels, because I'm just in the sort of beginning phases of bringing it back. It's a very challenging piece musically, and then on top of it, it's very challenging physically. Can I tell an interesting story about it?
Please, of course.
When I was practicing it for some performance, I don't remember exactly when, but I was practicing it in the basement of my uncle and aunt's house. And the basement wasn't big enough to do the whole thing, but I could do the very beginning and the very end where the frame is stationary. So I had my uncle and aunt come down to the basement and watch, the beginning and the end. My aunt's response was, "Wow, that music was so beautiful."
Wow.
Which, for podcast listeners who can only hear us, just note that Elizabeth and Nicole just made faces like, "What?"
That was not the reaction my family had when they heard portions of Barrio Sequenza.
Yeah.
Aww.
The barrio is, it's sort of the most classic kind of atonal music, where it's just crazy leaps, it's dissonant, it's wacky rhythms, it's not predictable. And something about framing it in a choreographic narrative structure allowed it to be perceived as beautiful, which I just thought was such an interesting, certainly wasn't like, hey, let's make the Barrio beautiful. That wasn't something we intended, but it's been interesting to experience how people respond.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, the performances, some of the performances I've seen you do live that have really stuck with me have been some of the little things we take for granted, like an Anderson etude or a Telemann fantasia. And then you choreograph it and I hear it so differently. I get new ideas from the movements that you use to help us hear the piece.
Choreographers hear music differently than musicians do. And it's so interesting. One of the very first projects I ever did with a choreographer, this was in ye olden times. Social media was a bulletin board at a dance studio. I put up a little sign that said flutist available for your projects. I got to do a project with a choreographer and she choreographed Syrinx, our famous flute solo by Debussy. And, at the end of Syrinx where the notes get really low and really soft and it just like fades into nothing on that low D flat at the end. During that long, low D flat, she had one of her dancers did this, like everything had been kind of winding down on stage, but then her dancer did this gesture where she made a fist and did a really it wasn't like a punch exactly, but it was like a very emphatic, mildly violent gesture in the middle of this quiet note. And I was like, what? I am killing myself here to play.
Be still.
To be still. And I mean, and my voice sounds outraged, but actually I was just so fascinated, because actually I felt like what she was in a way capturing was how hard I was working to make it sound like I was not working at all. That there was this like really intense thing happening within this sound that we work so hard to make it not intense. And so it was like a really great lesson in just that choreographers hear something that we don't necessarily hear. And so it is a wonderful way to work because it, just opens up a different way of hearing our music. Yeah.
Thinking about nutcrackers that I have played and like getting to the end of some solo that's beautiful. And as a pit musician, you're sitting so still. And so when you're really at the peak of your art, you're frozen and probably stiff because you haven't moved in hours. And the first time I looked up from, I forget if it was Snowflake or it doesn't matter. It was some insane thing that looks gorgeous and she's covered in glitter and a tutu and smiling, big, beautiful smile. But because I'm like 12 feet directly underneath her, I can see that she's also drenched in sweat and just panting, like her life depends on it. And it's always been so mind-blowing to me that we seek the same result in that we want it to be beautiful and we don't necessarily want the audience to know how hard it was, but I feel it seems much more violent for the dancers to achieve that, whereas it's much more, I'm making a restrictive gesture because I don't know the word that I want, but it's
like it's much more contained, feel like, and part of our training also is to not show the audience how hard it is.
Well, and the dancers get that too, but I feel like it's so different for
it's their whole body.
Yeah. I don't know. Art is funny.
Art is funny, man.
And that's going to be my intelligent contribution for the day.
No, it is. And actually, I think in a way, Nutcracker is such a good example of how musicians and dancers perceive music differently, which is how many times have you been in the pit for Nutcracker or some other ballet and just been like, why are we doing a huge retard here? Or that doesn't make, this tempo makes no sense, and the reason is it makes sense to the dancers, like the tempo that seems right for the music. It's the music is not the whole thing, and in the pit, the bummer part of it is that you can only perceive the music. You don't get to see the whole thing. And you don't even really necessarily get a sense of ownership over the whole thing because they are literally up on dancing on your head, where you can't see them. So I think remembering that it's just part of an organic whole, it's the audience perceives it as an organic whole.
Shifting gears, you've talked a lot about a couple of projects that you have going on right now or that are maybe in the hopper. A thing we've been asking our guests lately is if you could have a dream project fall in your lap, if obstacles did not exist and you could just do the thing that your heart has been wanting to do or the wildest thing that your imagination could cook up, what would it be?
Do I have to just pick one?
No.
I have a list. Well, actually, because of the Bach project and just this the power for me of working in a bigger with a bigger ensemble, I'm really interested in opera and ballet. So A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is this incredible book about a young girl from an immigrant family and how she grows up to be a writer. And the tree is this metaphor for the resilience of the immigrant community and for the kind of creative blossoming of this kid. And the book is full of music. There are more than 50 songs mentioned in the book. And so my project is to create a staged song cycle using music from the book, but creating our own arrangements that will be interdisciplinary, meaning we will be moving and or acting while we play. They will be interactive, so the audience will get to participate in some of them. And that song cycle will actually become a frame for a performance that kind of updates and localizes this story. So the story that takes place in like the 19 teens in Brooklyn, and I've been interviewing artists in my neighborhood, which is Sugar Hill in Harlem, about how immigration and migration have impacted their lives and their creative blossoming. And what I would like to ultimately do is like create the song cycle and then commission new works that are more reflective of the immigrant people and other people have different feelings about whether they are immigrants, migrants, or just New Yorkers, but the people who live in this neighborhood, like more reflective of the people who live in this neighborhood at this time. Music with African American roots, music with Latin American roots, music with Southeast Asian roots, and art reflective of the creative blossoming of this neighborhood, with The Tree Grows in Brooklyn as a frame for it. So for me, this is like a multi-year ginormous project. And so it does feel sort of like a dream. If everything goes right, that's what this project is going to be. My Tchaik 4 idea is to create I'll give you the big dream version, a sumptuous period drama, maybe a mini series that takes place in two time periods, Tchaikovsky's time period and our modern time period. And as you no doubt know, Tchaikovsky was gay at a time when it was not safe to be so, and that his Fourth Symphony tells kind of the story of what it was like to be an outsider and an insider at the same time. It tells the story of being an outsider in your own place. So I would like to have this period drama about Tchaikovsky and the writing of Tchaik 4, and then at the same time, a modern story, a modern kind of coming out story, perhaps of a musician who's studying Tchaik 4, like maybe me, the 23-year-old me. I think that would be a really amazing, cool, big project.
I'd watch.
And I have two more. Can I say two more?
Do it.
One is The Nutcracker, but the good parts version. So only Act 2.
Can we keep the mice?
Oh yeah, actually that's one of the good parts. Keep the mice, but not try to have any story. Just have numbers from The Nutcracker. Musicians on stage dancing with the dancers. So it'd only be about an hour long. It would be like super cool. And the fourth, this one is the least actually ready to happen, since we're putting it out into the universe and its magical powers vested in them by your question. I want to make an opera of a story that was on This American Life. This is a story that's maybe close to 20 years old, about a guy who was wrongly convicted of murder and sat in jail for many years longer than he would have because he never got probation because he refused to show remorse because he was innocent. And there's like this, the story is amazing, this like ragtag bunch of a real estate lawyer and this guy's friend from high school and various other people sort of band together to eventually figure out how to prove his innocence. And meanwhile, this person was in prison. Just like when I listen to this story, it's so operatic. He's just like, he just was like, I'm innocent. You know, all this, can I say a bad word? All this shit is happening all around him. I mean, he's living in the shittiest possible way as a prisoner, wrongly convicted. And, you know, he's been eligible for probation many times. And every time he says, I don't have any remorse. I didn't kill him. And they were like, okay, well, you can stay in prison for another 5 years. Like, I just have this image of him on stage, just like in a prison jumpsuit, except it's white and it's just glowing with innocence and it's all this stuff happening. And then in the end, I believe what happens is they find the person who actually, or they find the person who wrongly accused him, and he recants his testimony. And in the very end, they all have a picnic together when this guy gets out of prison. And it's like this incredibly beautiful, redemptive moment. And I think that would be an amazing opera. So watch this space. I think that's a 15-year project.
Well, we always like to end with some version of this question. I used to ask, what are 3 pieces you're listening to right now? But I don't want to be so limiting. So can you recommend 3 pieces of music to us that we should know and appreciate?
Well, the one that comes right to mind is Tchaik 4. I think it's just full of amazing stuff. And it does tell this amazing story. Well, it's Christmas time. So we're listening to Christmas music in my household. And one of my very favorite Christmas albums is called Noel Sing We For. And it's by this group called Noel Sing We Clear. And it's mostly English music, like Anglo-Saxon type music. It's just so fun and so full of life and celebration. So that would be a whole album.
Oh, give us some junk food. Do you have any musical junk food you like?
Yeah. So I just started doing this. I have my playlist that I listen to when I work out. Includes Despacito, the Justin Bieber number. Fight song, which I can never remember who it's by, but the one that goes, "This is my fight song, prove I'm all right song." I love that one. And then there's another, I would have to actually look at it to see who all these songs are by. There's a song called Azonto by a Ghanaian artist who I can never remember his name, but it's really catchy. Those are 3 from that that are my faves.
I love it.
I can't not move when I hear those.
Well, Zara, thank you so much for joining us this morning. This has been extremely inspiring.
Thanks for having me. I love talking about this stuff. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
I love hearing about it.
Yay.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.